All right, well, welcome everybody. This is the last installment for the, I guess, academic year of the Lunchtime Learning Series. And a tradition we started last year was to talk about some books that we're all reading that we think might be useful educators across the state to be aware of. So these are books that we selected as a team, the Family Financial Security team, based on what we've been reading about and hearing about and thought would be important to share. Bev, you're up first.
The book that I've read is Decisive. One of the things I was really impressed with the amount of research that went into this book. One of the things that I will highlight on it is all the endnotes that come along. There's a significant portion of endnotes at the back, so if you want additional information on every research study that they took part of or researched, there's additional information. So that was really kind of enlightening on that. So like I said, it's based on an exhaustive study of decisive making literature, and one of the things that I highlighted there is apparently when it comes to making choices, it seems our brains are slightly flawed. It was one of the things that they commented on, and if we look at humanity in nature, they have a very impressive track record when it comes to making decisions, whether it's career choices or business decisions. Many are frequently flawed, and even on our personal front. So if we think of, saving for retirement and when do we save and all those types of things, and or things like young people starting relationships with people who are bad for them, or and this is what I kind of related to, not just dealing with finances, but middle-aged people letting work interfere with their family lives. It all goes back to those decisions. So I found that kind of interesting. I also found that there was a certain extent where I found the book a little overwhelming, or maybe not necessarily overwhelming, but as I was reading it, I was like, okay, so this is great, so now what? So there's some other things that follow up. But one of the things they talked about was that there are 4 villains of decision-making. And in the book itself, along with the research, the 4 villains were narrow framing, and I'll talk just briefly about what each of those means, what's called the confirmation bias, short-term emotion, and overconfidence. And what they did is, in looking at each one of those 4 villains, they came up with what's called the RAP program, which I will go into here in just a moment. But when we think of, for example, I'll start with narrow framing. So when we try to make a decision on something, and what's really interesting is they compared like corporations or companies or organizations with sometimes how teenagers think. As a teenager, many times we have a very narrow scope. We have, like, if you can imagine a spotlight, and you're trying to make a decision, and all you see is what's in that spotlight, and you don't look at all the options and possibilities around us. So that's kind of where the narrow framing comes into play. So we need to be able to open up. But I did find it interesting that many times they're referred, organizations and companies referring back that many times they think like teenagers, which is kind of interesting when you think about it. So that whole idea of narrow framing. The second villain, the confirmation bias. If you think of an example, I like their example they used of. It just went right out of my head. The program where that people go on live and sing, and so people are going on there and they're not getting a strong vote, or their voice isn't as great as they thought it was, because through all their lives they've been getting your voice is wonderful, you do a great job, you sing beautifully, but they get on stage in front of all these on national television and it's just blown out of the water because they're not as spectacular as what it has been confirmed that they had this gorgeous voice. And so when we think of that confirmation bias, we tend to want to listen or to reach out to people who are going to tell us what we want to hear. So then what that does is it kind of skews our ability to make decisions because we're focusing on talking to the people or listening to the people of getting the information of what we want to hear rather than what is maybe truly the case. Then they talked about the third villain is the short-term emotion, where many times, and I think we can all understand this, where many times our decisions are based on emotions. We're not looking at that big picture. They had several examples of companies where maybe there's one idea. If a person has like a pet project, and if someone criticizes their pet project, they're highly offended and taken back because it's their pet project. But if you have many projects that you're a part of, and if somebody critiques them, you're more likely to be willing because it's not that one pet project. And then sometimes we have a sense of the fourth villain is overconfidence, and they tend to see this in representatives of organizations where things are going really, really well. Well, we did it this way, so we're confident that this is going to happen. They talk about that even like your specialists, whether it's financial specialists, whether it's large CEOs of corporations, where things are going well, because we get to that mode of confidence that we become too overconfident, and when we start making decisions, we still don't look at that bigger picture. So to kind of help deal with those four villains of decision-making, the authors have come up with and introduced what's called the RAP program. And so the RAP, the acronym stands for widening your options. The R for reality test your assumptions, attain distance before deciding, and preparing to be wrong. And I got to put my spectacles on here so I can see what I wrote. So, for example, widening your options, going back to that first villain, that narrowed framing, is because many times we tend to overlook all those options. It tends to be the whether or not types of decisions, and going back when I said the executives tend to react, many times behave like teenagers, that's one of the things I highlighted. Teenagers and executives often make those whether or not decisions. It's not looking at multiple options. It's just or. Can I do this or can I do that? Can I dump this guy or do I continue to go with them? Rather than looking at or and. So it's that whether or not decisions. Under the widening the options also is we need, when they look at uncovering all the new options, and when possible consider that that we might at the same time do what they call multi-tracking. So think and, not or. And then also to ask and find new opinions. So who are you going to ask? Well, you're going to ask the people who maybe had to solve that problem before and get their perspective. And then they also had a part in there where they called it laddering, where you first look for current bright spots, what's local. So if you're looking at starting something new, maybe you're an entrepreneur. So you try local and you look at the bright spots. And then you look at all the best practices. So you look regionally and expand it out. And then you take an even more distant approach to it, and you get all of that feedback to help make your decisions. So that's a part of widening the options. And then the R, reality test your assumptions. So when you're assessing your options, the options that are out there, that confirmation bias, which was one of the villains, led us to collect the information was often skewed. It was often self-serving information. And so one way to combat that bias is we would ask what they called as disconforming questions. So, like, for example, if you were going out to buy a new iPad, so not just looking at the reviews that you see online or whatever, but you're asking people, what problems does the iPad have, rather than what do you think about it? Also, they talked about zooming in and zooming out, looking at more specific information. So you're zooming out, getting more panoramic view rather than that spotlight, and zooming in to get a little more details when you ask those detailed questions. And there's the terminology, they call it whether or not we should ooch. And basically it's inching into something and scooting into something, and the word they came up with was ooch. So you'll have to read a little bit more information on that. But basically you're conducting, when you ooch into something, you conduct little small experiments to teach us more. So maybe it's, if I'm going to talk to my kids about finances, maybe it's giving them, we're going to ooch them into it, so we're going to give them small little things so that they can work through finance and have an understanding of finances or dealing with money. Now, when it's small, when it's not quite so it doesn't hurt so much if they make decisions that aren't the best. And then later on, they learn from that. And then when you look at the A, which is attain distance before deciding, basically our short-term emotions often tempt us to make choices that are bad in the long term. So one way to avoid that is we need to gain some distance. And we can do that by kind of shifting our perspective. For example, I was trying to think of one of the questions. What would I tell my best friend to do if they asked me? If I were to give my opinion to a best friend, what would I tell them? So we have to step back and ask those. Or let's say it's a corporation and they're having some large struggle and they don't know which decision to do. So one of the examples was, well, if a new CEO came in here, what would they do? And it helped them change the way that they looked at it. And also they talked about when decisions are agonizing that we need to really clarify what are our core principles, and then put that all into perspective. There was one story with that. It was something to do with the Navy. They were building these Navy ships, and they spent hours and hours and hours painting these ships. And so they all got together and looked at what are some things they could do differently. And one of the things was that the bolts on the Navy ship were made of steel, so they'd rust, and that's why they were painting. And so what they did is they had to do some brainstorming and speaking with the people higher above, and they put in these stainless steel bolts on this Navy ship. But it took them a long, long time, many coats of paint to finally come to this realization that these stainless steel bolts are what's going to help us to save this time of painting. And then the last one, P, prepare to be wrong. Many times we are overconfident, thinking we know how the future is going to unfold when in actuality we don't, and that we should prepare for those bad outcomes as well as good ones. And then what would make us reconsider our decisions if we're looking at that? And there was a piece in there where they talked about setting tripwires that snap us back to our attention at the right moment. So it's kind of like that whole behavior management. What's that little thing? If you think about your weight, maybe it's a specific weight that you get to that's going to be your tripwire to say, oh, I need to get back into shape, or I need to exercise more, or I need to eat better, as an example of setting that tripwire. So there's a lot of one of the things from the book is there's a lot of information in here, and I read through it once and then I started back through it again. But there's and I have it up there. There are lots of strategies and practical tools and stories that they use in the book, and then they also have follow-up. So at the end of the book, there's a section that's kind of they call them clinicals, and it's kind of like little self-studies you can do. You can read through and say, okay, what were the villains in when these individuals are making the decisions? What are things that we can incorporate? Do they need to widen their options? Do they need to do a reality check? Do they need to prepare to be wrong? So those are all included in the book. And then in addition, and I have the website up there, they offer next steps, which I haven't had a chance to delve into yet, but I did get onto the website. It's very easy to sign up for. I did listen to a couple of podcasts. There was an interview from one of the authors, and we're also one of the researchers on there. So if you're really excited about this information, there's so much more that can go beyond what the book has shared with us. And there's a workbook on there you can download, and then I have it listed there, 12 decision situations, where it's once again looking through and looking at some specific situations or decisions that were made, and you kind of go back and reflect. It's kind of like giving yourself a little test of some of the information so you can help apply it to your life. One of the things that they said over and over again in this book is we are all going to go through life and have good or bad decisions, but it's based on whether or not we, one, learn from those decisions, and two, what are the things that are prohibiting us from making those decisions. So it's great that we know this information, but now how are we going to move it forward to kind of help improve our decision-making process? So that's a very short and quick verses from the book. A lot of good information.
One of the reasons we chose this book is that it has a number of applications and including some web-based resources that you can use personally and in your educational activities as well. So I'm going to go on next with Jeff Updike's book, which is called Protecting Your Parents' Money. It was released in 2011, so it's a couple years old now. He's a reporter with the Wall Street Journal and has written on personal finance for many years now. And I think this is a book that he undertook in part because of his own journey dealing with his own parents, and then talking with with others who had been through this, both as professionals and personally. And it's an issue that many of us will confront as our parents age. And if you've already dealt with it, it's an issue that at some point your kids will deal with for you. So this is a multi-generational topic, and one that is plagued with all kinds of emotional issues. And so one of the nice things about this book that I liked is that it's a combination of some of the technical stuff. So how do you think about wills and estates, and how do you think about document preparation and that kind of thing. But also, how do you deal with the emotional aspects of it? How do you have a conversation with your parents about their declining ability to keep up with their bank accounts, or to balance their checkbook, or to pay bills on time, or whatever else? And the author calls this the talk, and has a whole chapter devoted to thinking about how you frame that conversation about maybe you feel independent, but you can't keep doing this. Or maybe right now you can do it, but there's going to be a day when you can't do it. And so how do we have that conversation about, handing over the financial keys, so to speak? I know there's a whole other set of issues around helping older people hand over the keys to their car. This is handing over their financial keys. And all the issues that are involved with that. So I like that. It has some ideas of conversation starters, and including some things not to say, sort of, from experience, what are the kinds of issues that might make people feel less comfortable. And I mean, the key is that this is in everybody's best interest, and it's not a case of losing independence or power, but, trying to be helpful. And that's the key of the conversation. One of the nice things about this book is that it gets into a lot of detail about issues. And if you go online and look at some of the reviews of this, some of the reviewers say, oh, it's too basic because it has too much of the basic details about different kinds of documents and, basic financial management. But the truth is that what the author talks about are the things that really matter. It's not as much that for, managing your parents' money, you have to make big decisions about how they should invest, or portfolio management, or become a financial advisor. It's more about the kind of mundane kind of stuff. Where is the paperwork for life insurance accounts? Where are checks being sent? Are checks being sent electronically? Are they being sent by paper? How much is coming each month? How much is coming in? Are there payments that are coming in on a biannual basis, or some other kind of frequency that might not be well known? One of the biggest issues, as the author points out, is that documents are lost, accounts are forgotten about, and there might be an account that's 20 or 30 years old. It may have be something that maybe the parent has forgotten about, or doesn't have good documentation about. And so just being organized is one of the key messages of this book, and helping sort of enumerate what are the kinds of categories of information that needs to be collected. It's Social Security, it's bank accounts, it's any investment accounts, it's knowing how payments are made and when they're made. If there are people who are helped develop some of these accounts or systems. So, for example, if there's an attorney who did a will or estate, if there's a broker or somebody that might have been involved in investing, who those people are, and making sure that you have some entree to those folks in case you need to take over those kinds of decisions. One of the key points of the book is, in addition to being organized and keeping track of what payments are coming in and what assets are owned, is making payments on time. Payment management, and so payments for insurance, payments for taxes, payments for services or other kinds of things, credit cards, utilities, those can get pretty overwhelming as somebody starts to have less physical and mental ability as they age. And oftentimes that's one of the early warning signs that somebody may be losing some of their cognitive ability, is when they're not making bills on time. But there's so many different kinds of bills. They're not all paid in the same kind of cycle. And many older people still are writing paper checks for these bills, and they're not using other kinds of automated payments. And it's easy to fall behind. And so just keeping up with payment management, what's supposed to be paid when. Maybe your plan is for the older person to continue to make those payments as long as possible, but it still requires some monitoring of how that's being made, and in sort of a backup plan in case payments aren't being made on time. The other nice thing about the book is it does go through, well, it's not a book by an attorney, nor is it meant to be a substitute for legal advice. It does talk about what are the sort of definitions of the documents that people need as they age. And, many of you know that Extension has some bulletins and publications that are available to help people as they begin planning financially and non-financially as they age. But this is nice because it gives a very succinct list of things like the durable power of attorney, the healthcare proxy, the living will, the Health Insurance Portability Act, or the HIPAA authorization to be able to speak to doctors, and a will, those kinds of things. So, again, it's not a substitute for, maybe a more detailed advice from a professional, or even a how-to book on how to design some of these documents. But it does help you understand what these documents are for, why they're important to have, and to be able to have the conversation with your parent about how these might be useful. One of the things that I think is nice about this book is, even if you are working with your parent and a financial professional of some kind, after reading this, you would have a better sense of what the terms are, and better be prepared to take the advice or not take the advice that you might get from a financial professional. And as the book points out, sometimes the professionals make these things more complicated, and by being armed with some information, you can actually be a better consumer of that professional advice that you might get either for yourself or for the advisor that might be set up for your parent. I don't have a lot of time to go into the details, but the book has a nice section on claiming Social Security and how that can affect how much an individual would receive in the short term and the long run. It also talks about other pensions and IRAs and 401ks and some of the tax implications of that. So it does have some pretty practical advice about how to think about taking resources and converting them into income and retirement. Beyond that, there's a section on long-term care and also on health care, which I think are quite good. And oftentimes health care is a major expense as people age, and long-term care is not that many people have long-term care, and so planning for long-term care, if you don't have insurance, as well as trying to take advantage of long-term care insurance if you're eligible for that, is an important topic. It does have a small section on reverse mortgages, which is where you convert some of your home equity into income, and also a section about the house itself and how do you deal with an owner-occupied home and as people age. So it's got a lot of topics covered, not all in great detail, but I think it's a great starter at the very least for thinking about your own progress in financial planning as you age, as well as having conversations with your parents as you begin thinking about their issues. If I have any critiques, it doesn't have a whole lot of information about financial fraud, which we know is oftentimes perpetrated against seniors, and so it would be great if it had more, another chapter on protecting your parent from financial fraud, things like, enabling getting credit reports or using other kinds of ways to monitor for ID theft. And also just more about technology. More and more seniors are managing bank accounts and investments online. And so that, we talked about the need to manage documents. There's also now a need to manage passwords and be listed on accounts and have the ability to manage, potentially even from afar, how that information is accessed online. So overall, it's a great book. It's a good value, given that the paper book is just around $13, and I think a good thing to have on your bookshelf as a resource, even if you don't spend your summer reading it. All right, I'll pause there, and we'll move on.
Okay. Thanks, Michael. This is Bridget, and I'm going to talk about a book called Scarcity, Why Having Too Little Means So Much. And this was a book that really caught my attention. Peggy Alves had mentioned it, and I was thinking about actually having a lot of thoughts about scarcity versus abundance and how we think about it personally and also nationwide, kind of how we think about, and it seems like we have a kind of a scarcity mindset right now. But looking at our past and what we've tried to do to talk about poverty and bring poverty education to our communities, we have the PACE curriculum, which is awesome. And Bridges Out of Poverty was something we had looked at before to kind of help explain human behavior in times of poverty, or we had the situational poverty and then the generational poverty that we would talk about with that. And then we decided not to use that for good reason. And now looking at some of the things that have happened since, I'm kind of putting this book in context in a sense. We've had the ACEs study, the Adverse Child Event Study, CDC, and also the Harvard Center on Developing Child has done some work with, a lot of work at looking at what toxic stress does to the development of a baby and a child as they grow. And so looking at some of these things and other, certainly some solid research saying that poverty impacts children and their development. And then also what I will say to start this book out is that the authors have a hard time or don't do a super job of talking about, just putting this in context too, that stress is obviously a major factor when it comes to anything that we might have some scarcity around. So on that first slide I've got scarcity can apply to food, like hunger, like in third world countries or here in some of our locations in our homes of our families that we work with, or dieting is another situation where we might be faced with scarcity. Time, we know what that feels like, and the authors talk about that extensively as a kind of a way to compare what we feel like when our time is scarce, when we've got tight deadlines, or when we seem to have abundance of time, kind of like in the Stephen Covey, when we feel like we've got slack. Oh, sure, 2 months down the road, I could do that, no problem. But then those 2 months go by, and suddenly it's the same as it was that week we decided to make that commitment. So time is one of those places where scarcity certainly applies. Social ties and love, the authors don't go into that too much, actually, but they do say that scarcity, those who are lonely don't necessarily have lower social skills, but it certainly could be the reverse, that the fact that they don't have a lot of social ties keeps them from developing those social skills, and so they don't go into that a whole lot. The one they really focus on is poverty, and whether that is situational or longer term. But poverty is something you can't get out of. You can't very easily walk away from. So they make special effort to pull poverty apart from some of the other things they talk about, although they like to make comparisons to some of these other things. So here is what they say about scarcity. And I would think both about time when you're thinking about these concepts, and think about certainly about poverty and how that impacts people. It impacts attention. So when we're in a mindset of scarcity, when we don't feel like we have enough to give, whether it's time or financial, we do definitely have a focus dividend. So that's kind of like stress. Stress gives us the adrenaline we need to be able to really put all our efforts into whatever it is we are working on. Similarly, there is kind of a spotlight effect or a focus effect that scarcity gives us, so that we really look at the problem in front of us. We look at that situation that we're in and we really focus on solving that. However, that means that there's also the negative side of that is that we are tunneling and that there are things that we neglect. So that's kind of like the book that Bev was talking about too, because I've been reading that a little bit. Dave, so there's a lot of things that get out of our spotlight and we don't attend to. So that might be like our parenting maybe, or what else might fall into that? Maybe a project down the road if we're really focused on the grant deadline today. So we've got lots of reasons why this is important. Then there's executive control that is impacted by scarcity, self-control and impulsivity. And they looked at the same people under different circumstances, so they manipulated them in the lab, basically, in a sense, and gave them different tasks and gave them different situations that they were looking at, basically taking away some of their. It's kind of hard to describe how they did this. They tickled their brain, is what the authors called it, with scarcity. So they made them, for example, think that they had to come up with money for a car repair. And so they told them that imagine that your car needs $300 worth of repairs and you need to come up with $150 right now to pay for your car. And they made sure that all of the subjects would find that to be relatively comfortable. And then they had a second task that the subjects had to do, and the car repair was now $3,000, and they had to come up with $1,500 to be able to car repair. So, and they had them do the same task, so it was an intellectual task under both circumstances. So and then that's why this is kind of confusing. But so they compared the same people to themselves, and those who had less real life financial resources in their real lives were able to manage that task under the less expensive car repair kind of brain tickle situation. But when they were in the situation where they had to try to come up with $1,500, that actually impacted their IQ and their performance on those tasks. However, the group of subjects that were higher income, they performed pretty much the same in both situations. So that gives you a sense of why this might really impact people's situation. So that's called a bandwidth tax, is what the authors end up calling all of these different factors, this cluster of effects that happen. Certainly it includes stress, but there's the distractions, the loaded brain, that tunneling effect, and your cognitive capacity that's available for use is impacted. So that's why there's this quote, the same person has fewer IQ points when she is preoccupied by scarcity than when she is not. Based on that, those tests that they had run, like I talked about, their IQ scores were actually 13 to 14 points lower compared to themselves just that same day. So our intellectual capacity and our ability to have executive control are impacted by thinking in that scarcity mindset. The idea of slack is basically like what Stephen Covey had said, is the same kind of idea that we have enough, so we don't really have to think about the trade-offs. We don't have to think very hard about our decisions at all. We have enough. We have what we need to make our decisions, and not to say, well, if I buy laundry detergent today, that means that I can't buy, my child their soy milk that they need because they can't drink regular milk. So, and no slack means that those of us that don't have enough resources to pay for everything, we have errors in judgment. If we don't have enough time to get it all done, we sometimes tunnel and make errors in judgment. And so we don't think about the bigger scope of things. We end up making some errors in what we decide to do. And that can look very kind of conspicuous to people who do have plenty of resources, who have that slack. When they look at what people are doing in the situation of scarcity or poverty, in a great variety of circumstances, poverty seems to correlate with failure, is what the authors say. And it's actually true. When they've looked through research, they tried to disconfirm that, but they couldn't. Looking at research, there's just a lot of evidence that there's a correlation between poor performance or poor decisions and poverty. But is that really due to the people themselves? And a lot of what they point to is that it's a factor of being in the situation of scarcity, which we sort of know. That some of this book has a lot of stuff that we sort of know because of the research we've done ourselves and the work that we do with people. We know that this is true. But so understanding people in poverty, scarcity leads us to tunnel and focus and then borrow now, whether it's time or food, like maybe eating too much on Sunday and saying, I'll start my diet on Monday, and then push us deeper into scarcity. Well, that means I only have 1,200 calories I can consume on Monday then because I ate a big bowl of ice cream on Sunday. So we have to borrow now to be able to do what we need to now. We're tunneling, and that means that we have scarcity later, more scarcity. We push that scarcity back and increase it. And I know we see that with the people we work with when we do budgeting and credit counseling and credit education. So parenting and scarcity, there's also, they did something about this. And being a parent, I know what this feels like. They had this idea of air traffic controllers, and they looked at air traffic controllers parenting after a day of a lot of plane traffic, and it was just really an overwhelming day where they were just constantly, flagging planes down or whatever they do. They were just, it was an incredibly hectic day. And then they looked at nights where they didn't have so much traffic. And it's a very stressful job, especially on those days where there's a lot going on. And they looked at their parenting. They did some good, solid research around what that parenting looked like under those two different sets of circumstances. And what they found was that when parents came home and they had already used up a lot of their bandwidth, as these authors call it, they had used up their bandwidth by the end of the day, their parenting looked a lot different. It looked like poor parenting. So this is just something they wanted to bring up in that section about poverty specifically, because I think the author's intent is to try to get people to think differently about scarcity and poverty and what people tend to assume about that situation. So they talked about how to design programs to account for this. I thought this was pretty interesting. It was this is still a developing kind of concept, and I'm not sure how far it's going to go. It'd be interesting to see what ends up happening with this idea of scarcity and how they follow up. But they said to have programs that allow for fault tolerance, so that when people, for example, if you have a progressive parenting education series that's 8 sessions long, that if they miss 1 or 2 in a row, that they don't end up feeling like they can't come anymore, or so to run consecutive sessions so that they can continue to go and feel like their hard work is paying off, and be successful, because we know that their lives are, they're faced with scarcity, they're faced with stress. Incentives and penalties need to fall within the tunnel. And a good example that they gave was the 5-year limit on W-2, their TANF. Until you get to that last month or the last week, you may not really fully realize that your ability to tap those resources is running out because you are so tunneled and focused on solving that next problem. So making sure that we find ways to get people to recognize those incentives and penalties as they need to occur, and we need to enforce those. Skill and information-based education is just not effective. It's just because of the bandwidth tax, because there's so much cognitive overload. And we know this, so a lot of this doesn't come as a surprise, but that we need to design programs to be a little different. They need to be learner-centered, short, and behavior-based. Keep it simple. Not like this PowerPoint. And reduce the hoops and juggling involved whenever possible, so that they don't have more paperwork to do and more things to tackle. If at all possible, make it as simple as you can, the process and the learning environment. Changing the environment and managing abundance is also some strategies to account for scarcity, and that's for us. That's to make us be able to manage better. So set our environments up so that we can account for some of these problems that scarcity brings, and then learning to set ourselves up so that when we do have that slack and abundance, that we know those times of scarcity may come, and we try to prevent some of the problems that come with it. So when it comes to this book, I thought it was really good, but it also felt like it was way too long for what was in the book. A lot of other people had said that too, that it could have been a nice long article. But it does provide a good psychological framing for poverty, and I think it's at least an interesting alternative idea to use when thinking about it. And I don't know, but it's worth reading. It is just a little bit long, so you could probably skim some sections, and it's just a good concept.
Okay, this is Kristi, and I'm going to talk about our last book for this afternoon, and that book is titled Switch: How to Change Things When Change is Hard by Chip Heath and Dan Heath. So this is another book by the same authors that Bev Dahl talked to us about when she spotlighted Decisive. This book is a few years old. You'll notice that it was published in 2010. It's a relatively quick read. It's around 258 pages, and not a real expensive addition to your collection of resources at $12. This book was of interest to me because it was listed on our summer reading, and I had also heard about it from another colleague that had mentioned it was a really good read and something that really made them step back and think about how they approach change. On our financial reading list, it's described as a practical guide to making changes in a range of domains. And one of the things that really jumped out at me as I read the book is that the book is described as presenting a framework for change, really a three-part framework that I'm going to talk more about. But that framework is useful for lay people, so individuals that maybe don't have lots of authority or resources to implement certain types of change, that despite perhaps a lack of authority, there is the ability to approach change using this framework and achieving success, implementing a change. One of the things that I, too, really enjoyed about this book by Chip and Dan Heath is that there's lots of storytelling throughout the book. So just tons of examples about how this three-part framework could be implemented. And the other thing that I really enjoyed, and I know Bev referenced this in their other book as well, is that they offer clinics throughout the book, so examples, and they sort of encourage you as the reader to think about how you might apply the change theory that they've discussed. So, like I said, to me that was a great way to be able to use the knowledge that you're reading about as you progress throughout the book. There's a clinic in nearly every chapter. And then looking at our next slide, this book, Switch, is really framed around a kind of a brain analogy that was shared by Jonathan Haidt. And some of you might be familiar with this change analogy where the brain can be visualized in two parts, as an elephant, which is the emotional side of the brain, and some of us might view that elephant as, really a huge and critical piece of the brain, really a 6-ton elephant. And that emotional side of the brain means sometimes that we might approach change in kind of a lazy manner. That emotional side of the brain is looking for a quick payoff, and sometimes it's skittish. The other part of the brain is the rider, and that's this person who's sitting on top of the elephant, and that's our rational side of the brain. And the rational side of the brain really holds the reins and seems to be the leader as change is approached. But the rider's control is very precarious because the rider is very small in relation to the elephant. So when the rider and the 6-ton elephant disagree, the rider will lose because he's overmatched. And the rider often struggles to keep the elephant on the road to reach the destination. So when you think about any change that you've struggled to achieve, whether it was, changing your eating habits, trying to be more active, you can kind of apply this analogy that, again, Jonathan hates put together for us, and this analogy is what's used in the book Switch. As I may have mentioned, Dan and Chip Heath used this analogy to build a framework for how to deal with change. They actually suggest 3 primary ideas in order to achieve a change even when change is hard. The first one is described as directing the rider. So there are actually 3 things suggested below that, but I'm going to focus just on 2 of them in lieu of the time, 2 for each of these. So in directing the rider, one of the things that we might do is find the bright spots. To find what's working and clone it, in the book they talked about a Save the Children example where the organization Save the Children went to Vietnam and their job was to fight malnutrition. And they didn't come in and try to tell everyone what they should do. They actually implemented this process where they focused on finding the bright spots, visiting people in villages in certain pockets of Vietnam that were very successful in having healthy children and healthy families despite what was available to eat there. And they used that, finding what works and cloning it, to teach others in the village of how they might replicate it. So it was a really effective way of directing that rider by finding bright spots. Again, that is the rational side. The rider sometimes might spin its wheels. So if we can find the bright spots and clone it, that's an effective way of moving this change forward. The other thing about directing the rider that I thought was really important and struck me as something to really include in any change approach would be to script the critical moves. So rather than looking at a change as a really big picture, what are some specific things that we can do to achieve that change? So one of the other stories in the book talked about an example in West Virginia where they really wanted people to be healthier. Well, as you can imagine, being healthier, what does that mean? It's so overwhelming and huge that you can see how we might get lost in a change like that. And what they did was they implemented this idea of scripting the critical moves by launching a campaign that asked West Virginians to be healthier by simply buying skim or 1% milk rather than whole milk. And that was the approach that they took to reduce some of the fat in the West Virginians' diets. And again, scripting the critical moves. Were there other things that could have been included so that those folks were healthier? Definitely. But again, they scripted the critical moves. And they, again, moved away from that big picture of being healthier and were very specific. The other thing in implementing this change framework is that while it's great to include and work with the rider, we can't forget about the elephant. And in fact, we need to motivate the elephant. And again, here, I thought finding the feeling was a critical example where knowing something isn't cause for change. But if we feel something, we may be motivated to move towards that change. Again, they gave a story here where there was a corporation that a purchasing manager was studying purchases company-wide across a variety of different locations, and they found that all of their locations were buying work gloves, but they weren't buying the same work gloves, and the cost varied from a couple dollars to $7 for a set of work gloves. Now, as a purchasing manager, you might just kind of recoil at such a thought that, an inefficient purchasing model was being implemented in the company. And you probably are crunching some dollar signs in your brain, seeing how change or savings might be achieved if they implemented a different model. So the purchasing manager might have, pulled up a spreadsheet and showed a lot of numbers, but instead the purchasing manager found the feeling behind this to motivate the elephant by presenting at a board meeting a pile of work gloves with tags on them with the prices, which had a very emotional reaction to all of the board members and the leadership that were in the room, which motivated their elephant. that, again, it evoked emotion, that, wow, this is crazy that we're spending this amount of money on gloves, and in some cases the gloves were the exact same. The only difference was, again, the vendor that they were purchased from and the price. So they were able to move towards change by finding the feeling. The other thing with the elephant is that, as I mentioned earlier, that elephant is skittish. And so if we can shrink the change, making it less scary for the elephant, it's much easier to achieve that change. So think about, in perhaps your situation, have you ever been in a position where you needed to change your personal budget or even your office budget? If you were told you needed to cut 5%, that might be very scary. You might feel the skittish elephant coming out in you. How am I going to do that? But instead, what if you could shrink the change? The example that was shared in the book would be, again, with this cutting 5% from the budget, that you might just pick 2 to 3 budget lines each week and work on those budget lines. First week, perhaps training. The next week, travel. And that seems much more manageable by shrinking the change, taking it on bite by bite. And then finally, the third part of this change framework is to shape the path. And by shaping the path, we're really talking about building good habits. Again, a story here of a GM executive needing to increase safety at one of their plants. So they certainly had a safety policy. They had best practices that they wished their workers to engage in, but what they found is that some people on the floor were not engaging in those safety habits and recommendations. So they painted a blue line around the plant, and they had wooden men wearing the safety gear, and the intent there was to build good habits, that some of those visual cues were action triggers, that when they cross that blue line, they need to make sure they have their safety gear on. So again, building good habits. And then the last thing that I thought was really important with shaping the path is to really rally the herd. So I think all of us have probably heard this phrase that, you know, behavior is contagious. Is yours worth catching? So the idea is to help it spread, to model that behavior and to bring others on board. And the last slide that I have regarding the book Switch is some additional resources. Bev referenced these when she talked about Decisive, and I would just encourage you to visit these resources as well. You just need to share an email, and you can access these resources. What I thought you may be intrigued by is that you can, first of all, download a one-page reference about this change framework that I described today, and that will include 3 strategies under each: direct the rider, motivate the elephant, and shape the path. And also, if you want to preview the book before you would purchase it or add it to your collection, you can download the first chapter. And then, as Bev added, there's also a number of workbooks and other resources that you might check out with regards to change and making it happen even when it's hard. So I think that, again, this is a worthy addition to your resources. And as Bev pointed out, too, this book also contained a wealth of endnotes. I was very impressed by that. They had 254 connections that they had made throughout the book to different studies and other books, so very well put together. I think the type of framework that all of us could see some application for in our personal lives and in our work.
Great. I want to thank all of our presenters for talking about each of these books. You've got 4 things to potentially add to your reading list. We picked books that were accessible. Now you definitely have a sense of what is in each of these and how you might find them of interest to your own work. We encourage you to pick these up, and we'll also be searching for more books when we do this again next year. So if over the next year you find something that you think is particularly good or it might be helpful for others, let me know, and we'll include them as we begin to think about this exercise next year. And let me just say thanks to all of our presenters today, and this could be you next year. What you'll get out of it is a copy of each of the books and the ability to share your insights with your colleagues. So I would encourage everyone to think about doing this in the future. We will be taking the summer off from the Lunchtime Learning Series. There will be some webinars this summer on financial coaching, so stay tuned for those. Those will be coming out, and we'll continue to keep you posted by email as well as we begin to roll out the next set of topics that have been set up for next year. So thanks so much, everybody. I'll probably see many of you, but if not, have a great summer.